Hello, I'm Richard Vobes, the Bald Explorer, and this is the second part of my story. I was very nervous about putting the previous video on where I started to tell my autobiography, if you like, an oral history of my life, and the response was very overwhelming and encouraging, and people have said, you know, I'd like to hear more. So I will continue then with this, and if you're watching on YouTube, I will make a special playlist so that it separates these, so you can, if you miss them, you can find them more easily. So thank you very much for all the lovely comments out there. And I mentioned my friend Peter Richardson from the old days, and it was wonderful to see him pop up on Facebook. So that's great. Hopefully because he obviously appears in my life, he can vouch for some of the things, but it's not so much that, it's more just confirming that my memory of the events is the same as his memory of them. Because you know how easily it is when you're remembering things, you might put a gloss on it, or you might remember it in a slightly different way, and then people get back and say, no, it wasn't like that at all. Really? But that's how I recall it. So it's great to have somebody else or other people on the way going, oh yeah, I remember that, and it was like that. Or actually, do you remember this? And you go, oh yeah. So there's so many things. The other reason for doing this, and it's encouraging to see people sharing bits of their story, is I really think it's important that people do share their lives. People aren't writing or keeping diaries as much as they used to. And so I think if this is an easier way for people to do it digitally, doing it live and recording, you get a sense of the person at the same time. So continuing my story then, going back to when I was young, and I spoke about the times I ran into a table and I had my finger jammed in a door, which seemed to resonate with people. I do remember when I was about 9 or 10, I had tonsillitis, as most kids get. And back in those days, of course, you'd go and see the doctor and they said, oh yes, you've got tonsillitis, straight down to the hospital and we'll whip them out. And whilst we're there, we'll take your adenoids out too, which is what happened to me. And it's quite a thing, isn't it, when you're a kid and you've never been to the hospital and you've never seen the side of an institution like that at 9. The biggest sort of buildings that you know is your primary school. And yeah, so in I went, and of course in those days it wasn't an operation that you went in early in the morning, they did the operation in the afternoon, and then you went home in the evening. I can't remember exactly how many days I was there, but it was probably 3, 4 or 5. And so you go in, there's the anticipation of sitting on the ward. I don't remember my parents being with me. I remember them visiting afterwards, but I don't remember them being there beforehand. I do remember going, and I remember this very clearly, being wheeled into the theatre, and there you are, and they're going to put this gas onto you to put you to sleep for the operation. And I remember them saying you need to count to 10, and by 10 you'll be asleep. And I remember thinking, what if I'm not? I don't think it's going to work. I won't be asleep. And I started to count, and I remember getting up to about 3 or 4. I don't remember. I don't remember thereafter, because clearly I did fall asleep. But I do remember the terror of the gowned figures looking down, and knowing that I had to go through this, even though I didn't want to, and that mask being put on and being told to count. That was quite scary. I don't remember the business about waking up, but I remember being in hospital and my father visiting, and I was in this big ward, like the old hospitals were, with these big old metal beds and things. And the nurses were all very nice. you know, my overall impression, it was in Horsham Hospital, was that it was an okay experience other than the theatre bit. And my dad came in and gave me a telescope, this metal telescope, and it was the single most act of generosity that my father did for me that has been etched in my memory. I'm sure that he did other things of generosity, but at that time and subsequently, my dad didn't do a lot of things on birthdays or special occasions which were etched in my memory. And I'll probably talk more about my father later on as this goes. My mum is the one who was generous with money and toys and gifts and all of that. And again, I'll talk more about my mother later on, because they were poles apart. And of course, my parents, as they do, influence your life. So I'll get on to that. But I vividly remember this telescope, and I also vividly remember that the bed had its back to the window and I couldn't see out the other window. And so I could use the telescope in bed to sort of look around the ward, which everything was very, very close and, you know, too close really. And I remember thinking, what a useless present, because I can't look out the window. And it wasn't his fault, of course, but it was, you know, I was a brave boy going to hospital, and he gave me this thing. But he gave me this thing, and it's a funny thing, as I say, that's really etched on that piece of generosity, because it was a quality, small. I would imagine it was probably only about 1.5 feet long, well, maybe 2 foot about 1.5 feet. Anyway, so that's a memory when I was young. Growing up at that time, at the back of where I lived in Horsham was a farm, and over the time between moving into Horsham at 5 years and leaving Horsham at 18, during those years, the farm at the rear of where we lived in a cul-de-sac, and then behind us was this farm. The farm went from being a working farm with old Mr. Wells, who used to live in the farm, and his wife, to being a derelict farm. Now, I don't know the sequence of events of what happened, but I think his wife died. He was then on his own, and either he sold the farm or he went to live with his son, who had another farm at the north end of where I was. Well, actually, it wasn't north. It seemed, yes, I suppose it is more north than where I was. So it was like 2 adjoining farms, as far as I remember. And I don't know the facts, so they could have got this all slightly muddled. But he, I think, went to live with his son, or he had died. But I don't think that's the case. But the point I was trying to get to is that the farm became empty and then over time derelict. And in all the time that I was there was a farm there, even though it was empty and derelict, and it just lay abandoned. I can't remember whether the fields were being worked. I think maybe the farmhouse and all of that were abandoned, but actually the farm itself was still being worked, because I think there were still crops in it. So I assume that the old Mr. Wells had gone to live with his son, or his son had taken over the farm but not the buildings. Anyway, it became, for a young lad in his, from 7 onwards, I suppose, a playground. It was a fantastic space. And of course, it is why in my core, I feel that farming, although I've never been a farmer, of course, is so important to me. Fields, and the older ways. Now, of course, you know, you're talking about the 60s, so the tractors were being used, and there were hay bales. We're not talking about going back to the sort of 50s or 40s where they were the stooks, I think they were called stooks, of hay, which was all gathered up by hand. It was all done mechanically, but different from the hugely intensive farming that we see now. So there would be, I would go with my friends walking over the fields, and I remember in a particular occasion grabbing a whole load of these hay bales and building a little camp, not realizing it was the farmer's property. Of course, you know, it was a bit silly. We'd drag these hay bales and make a hut, and we would clamber on top of it and enjoy this sort of hay or straw, maybe it was straw bales, and have this little house. We were continually building camps, climbing trees, building camps over this farm. And there were several fields and a stream. There was the Red River, which was running sort of north-south, and there was the River Arun, which was coming from the main area of Horsham, the centre of Horsham, behind St Mary's Church really. And it did go southwards, but first it was going eastwards and then going south. So it would come very close to where I lived. And Peter and I would very often go down hunting for things like old bottles, because there was some sort of Victorian dump. Lots of old bottles had been dumped and smashed in various places, and we would dig around and find these old cod bottles, I think they were called, the ones with the marbles in, and we would find stone jars, ginger beer jars, and both Peter and I would collect these and wash them and keep them, and we both had collections. Now I think Peter managed to hold on to his, but because my family later on got divorced and my mum and dad sort of moved about a bit, a lot of my personal stuff as a kid just got lost or dumped or I don't know, is somewhere, but I have no idea. I probably lost, which is a bit of a shame. But I remember my dad had these army telephones. These were old-fashioned, you know, almost Bakelite telephones, I think, great big receivers in these silver boxes, and it would be connected to the line, whatever the line was, and you would turn a handle like this and it would make out of the earpiece this searing noise, which was effectively ringing. Now these were old army, presumably these were Second World War ones, I don't know, but he had a pair of these, and I have memories that Peter and I and perhaps some other friends and I would take them out into the farm, clip them onto barbed wire, and you'd have two sets of barbed wire. So you'd have effectively a positive and negative, and you could be at one end of the field and one other end of the field with this connected by crocodile clips, and you could turn this hand, make this silly noise, and then the other end you go, hello, because we loved doing that. But we had nothing to say to each other. That was the stupid thing, is we would love ringing each other going, hello, oh hello, can you hear me? Yeah, I can hear you. And then not much else. And I think we had some long cable or something, and we would run these phones all over. My dad was in communication, and that was his, and we'll get on to more about what he does in a later video. But yeah, these phones again, they were etched, amazing old props. And throughout my life, I was introduced to some of, I think through, as you do, through your parents, some of the old things like Grundig tape recorders. And I'll talk about that and how they've influenced my life. The old reel-to-reel ones I'm talking about, gramophones, and the 78s, and typewriters. But going back to the farm, before I finish on this particular one, I don't want these to go on too long. There was an area close to where I lived, about, I don't know, 100 yards down the lane that was at the back of my house, called the Orchard. I don't know whether we called it the Orchard or whether it was just known locally as an orchard, but there was a whole load of trees, cooking apple trees mostly, because you couldn't eat these apples, but they grew to huge sizes. And it was all overgrown with brambles and underwood and that sort of thing. And presumably at one point it had been a bit of an orchard, but these were old trees now, a number of them. And it must have been an acre square, something like that, perhaps 2 acres. It's very difficult to visualize. And it became, that was a place that we built a lot of camps, but also there were these bunkers in them. Thinking now, they may have been root holes. I didn't think of them as root holes at all, but they may have been where trees had fallen over and been pulled out, because there were these great big sort of, well, they looked like bunkers. So you could run round this orchard through the stinging nettles and the undergrowth, and we'd whack passages through all of this, and they're all round the trees. You could climb the trees, which was fantastic and fun to do. We could lob apples at each other, especially when they were just small and growing. That was great fun, and surprise one another. We could play hide and seek, and my sister would come over and we would do all those sort of things. And often I would take toys down there as well. And the things that I used to play with was the Thunderbird toys and the UFO toys. And you'd get down in one of these, I suppose they were tree holes, root holes, and we would play in there, and you know, these things would drive around, and an international rescue. And I remember play acting all the characters in these little stories. So I would take myself off on my own down there, or I would be down, you know, with a mate playing around there. They were very, very happy days. In the next part, I want to tell you about, I've mentioned the bottles and things, but in the next part I'll tell you about when Peter and I found a grenade on the farm and a stash of money. So join me again next time. I'll piece these on, they won't be all at once, I'll just piece them out as and when. But thank you so much for watching. If you've enjoyed this and would like me to continue, then do give me a thumbs up, make a comment in the comments, and if you're watching, Peter, do add some memories to it, because yeah, we got up to all sorts of mischief. That's not even mentioning the car dump. But anyway, until next time, thanks for watching. Bye bye.